Black and Latino communities have been disproportionately impacted by the coronavirus. Vaccine rollout is underway across the U.S. with 60% of Americans saying they would get it. Still, Black Americans represent the least inclined population, with only 42% saying they would get the vaccine. Today, we're diving deeper as to why this is the case, and I'm joined with visiting professor of the practice of race and ethnicity at Brown University, Dr. Ronald Arbert. Thank you for joining us today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we want to start off with the historical context of this. Why do communities of color have this distrust with medicine? And I know there's some well-known medical experiments and cases that have affected Black communities, like the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment and even Henrietta Lacks. Can you explain how these might be playing a role in what we're seeing today?
Absolutely. I think what we tend to forget, we try and treat these as if they were ancient history, and they're not. So the Tuskegee study went from 1939 to officially ended around 1972. If you were born in 1972, you're 48 years old today. That means that you may have grown up hearing these stories from family members, parents, or grandparents. And so these are, first of all, these were all very atrocious, but they're also not ancient history. And then we had this whole wave of involuntary sterilization that happened primarily in African-American women. And that happened pretty much across the country. That wasn't only in the South. That happened also in the Northeast. And so there, in 1972, there was a walkout of medical students who were protesting the fact that they were doing these involuntary sterilizations on primarily Black women just to get practice. And so this is not ancient history. So I think that's what we tend to forget when we start to think about why people are somewhat skeptical.
And can you explain for those who don't know what the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment was?
Sure. So in the I guess it officially started in 1939, and it was a study of the natural history of syphilis in Black men in Tuskegee, Alabama. And these people were followed for, up until 1972, where they were just looking at the manifestations of syphilis as it was untreated. Now, to put this in context, in 1947, penicillin was approved and began to be used to treat things like syphilis. Syphilis is a bacterial disease. So there's a huge ethical piece here in terms of why these people, first, they didn't know why they were in the study. They didn't know exactly what was being studied. They didn't know that they weren't receiving treatment. They didn't know much about the disease in terms of how it was transmitted. So there's a huge ethical problem. And the primary objective was to see how the disease progressed from the time they were infected to the time they died. So that basically what the study was about. And when treatments were available, they were withheld. They weren't tried. They didn't try to see if they could treat late stage syphilis with some of these with penicillin.
Okay, and so even not just medicine here, there's also trauma when it comes to government and law enforcement interaction with communities of color. How might that play a role too today, in people's hesitancy?
Sure. Well, the Tuskegee study was a public health service funded study, partly funded by the National Institutes of Health. And so there's a governmental piece to that as well. I think any of the institutions, people are somewhat skeptical because they have not served communities of color well over the years, and so there's a natural skepticism around this, and I get it. I understand that. I've talked to my relatives. I have aunts and uncles who are in their 80s and are contemplating, taking the vaccines. And so, again, these are not long. We think these things are happening like years and years ago, but they're not that. It's not ancient history.
And to that point, some people believe that the vaccine message would be best received for communities of color from professionals that look like them. So what kind of role does minority healthcare workers play?
Yeah, I think diversity is a good thing regardless. I think we make better decisions when we have diversity. There's a level of confidence that people will have if they see people like them who are part of the process. I mean, you're just going to naturally be more likely to trust something if you feel that people who look like you might be able to represent your points of view are part of the process. And I think that's natural and that's reasonable, and that makes a lot of sense.
What do you think the danger is if communities of color, play into this hesitancy and don't get vaccinated?
Well, we sort of suffer the possibilities of continue to be ravaged by this pandemic. I think it's important that people understand the benefits of being vaccinated and the importance of being able to protect themselves against what is really becoming just a really ravaging pandemic for communities of color.
And if you had a message for communities of color, Black and brown communities, how would we move past this? What would that message be in your perspective?
Well, I think people should always seek information, try to be as informed as they can, try to understand what they can expect, what the potential side effect profiles might be. All of those are reasonable things for people to ask and inquire about. So I think you want to be as informed as possible. You want to feel comfortable and think you're doing something that's going to be good.
And is there anything else that you might want to add to this entire discussion about why communities of color might be hesitant to get vaccinated?
Well, I think we also have to think about how we communicate, because if we seem like we're targeting communities of color, it's not because the color of their skin. It really has to do with the fact that they're disproportionately represented in jobs that are at risk. And so I think if our communication was not so much around race, which sort of puts us in the framework of a biological explanation, but we talk about what actually puts people at risk, the fact that they're in jobs that disproportionately put them at risk. And so if we prioritize with respect to why people are at particular elevated risk, we're going to disproportionately have the people represented that we want. And so I think by racializing it, I think is where we as the health community and the medical community, I think we need to sort of think about that.
Insightful knowledge there. Dr. Albert, thank you for your time and joining us with this information today.
Thank you for having me.